Welcome to the Edelheit Experience, a compelling conversation about revolutionizing health and well-being, bringing you rich stories and lessons learned from leading corporate executives. Now, we'd like to introduce your host, Jonathan Edelheit.
This is Jonathan Edelheit. Welcome to the Edelheit Experience. Today, I have Veetahl joining us. Veetahl, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Such a pleasure to be here.
Maybe you could introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
With pleasure. So I'm Veetahl. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Sorbet. We're a fintech and HR tech trying to disrupt paid time off. That's what we do. It's my first startup, so I don't come from an entrepreneurial background. I've spent most of my career in financial services, working at a few multinational banks all over the world, the US, Switzerland, and in Israel. And most recently, before starting this company, I was the chief marketing officer of the largest credit card and payments company in Israel called Isracard.
Now, everyone is trying to jump into the wellness bandwagon. And I think originally, when everyone thinks of wellness or well-being, they're thinking about physical fitness trackers, people, things to engage you, get you to change behavior. But now it's going way beyond that. And I feel like with the spin that Sorbet is taking, you guys are kind of on that innovating cutting edge where people would be like, I never thought about that before. And the last 2 years, we've seen from the pandemic a tremendous amount of stress. Mental health issues have been off the charts. Probably can't even measure the negative effect that they've had and where we're at with it. Why do we need to rethink corporate well-being?
I think it's about corporate well-being is two-pronged, right? It has to do with the wellness of your employees in order to prevent burnout and reduce turnover and acknowledge the tectonic shifts that have gone through people's lives in the last couple of years. But it also has to do with the wellness of the company, the financial wellness of the company, the ability of the company to mitigate uncertainty when it comes to things like pandemics and other external things that can happen to a company. And it really is up to senior stakeholders to take into account both. And we're kind of programmed to think that they're antagonistic to one another, that, taking care of employee well-being is not necessarily conducive to the bottom line. But we've actually found an approach that serves both and kind of proves that by investing in employee wellness, you could actually move the needle on business results as well.
And what I think is cool is that everybody's focused on, let's figure out how we can get people to be healthier or engage them or get them to be more physically fit, eat better, and then there's a lot of tech plays all around medical conditions. And there's been a lot of investment in, these billion-dollar unicorns in mental health to approach mental health. Share with us that vision of how Sorbet has creatively tied, PTO into well-being in a concept that I think is so simple. Once you hear it, it's kind of like, this makes perfect sense.
Yeah, so I think that there are two things to this that are worth mentioning. One is that there's this really amazing benefit that employers have been providing to their employees since almost the beginning of time, right? And it's been around forever. And it's a massive line, on the balance sheet. But then it's almost ignored. It's obviously underused. And instead of utilizing something that is already there and is an amazing benefit, and if you think about it, employers actually pay their employees to take time off. They pay them not to work, to take care of themselves, to recharge and recoup. It's probably the most amazing benefit, and we're kind of overlooking it, and it's already there. So there's this one element of you're already budgeting for it. It's already there. Why don't we reposition this? Why don't we reintroduce it in effect and celebrate how amazing it actually is as a benefit before everything else? And the other side of it is really, offering people things like wellness benefits and meditation apps and apps that encourage you to exercise requires something a little more intentional and purposeful around when do people actually have the time to do all of that, right? Because we're working round the clock, we're not working from home, we're expected to, do all of our, home activities as well as work at the same time. And in effect, it doesn't really matter how much you suggest that people should meditate or go for a jog. If you don't intentionally, take it upon yourself to also make sure that they have the time and the resources, to do that. And that's kind of our approach, to firstly make sure that people that people take this time, that they have this time allocated towards their wellness and actually have some budget allocated towards it as well. And so the way that we do that is actually pretty simple. We connect with company systems. It could be an HR system or a payroll system, and we analyze people's time off consumption habits and preferences. So we can predict for each and every employee the portion of their time off balance that is actually usable, that they will be able to use as time off, as well as the portion of their time that is unusable. It's important to mention in this context that on average, you as employees only use about 70% of their time off. And that creates a huge problem for both employers and employees. And we may want to touch on that in a minute. But at the end of the day, it is important to acknowledge that even if people are very, very diligent and aware, there's a good chance that a portion of their paid time off is actually unusable as time. And so what we do is we create this bespoke time plan for each and every employee. And we can come to you and say, hey, Jonathan, out of your outstanding 22 days off that you currently have in your balance, we predict that you'll be able to use about 17 of them as time off. And we will actually proactively suggest when you can take this time that most fits your preferences and habits and lifestyle and life stage and so on without compromising the work. But then we'll come to you and you say, there are 5 days on your balance that we predict you won't be able to use. And so if you choose, instead of getting those locked away in an illiquid asset called accrued time that you won't be able to touch and you won't be able to use through Sorbet for the first time ever, you will be able to cash those out today and use them as you please, anytime, anywhere. And we will actually start to proactively suggest highly curated and personalized activities and experiences around travel and wellness and hospitality. So to incentivize you essentially to reinvest it in yourself towards your vacation and towards your wellness. And that's what we do. And by doing that, I'm guessing we'll get into that in a second, but it provides real financial value and wellness value to both the employee and the employer.
Yeah, I would think that every CEO, C-suite, director of benefits, has to realize that, burnout is at an all-time high. And, more important than ever, where before, I think companies may not care if people take their PTO. It's almost, there's that one aspect of you need to recharge. You've got to take your time off. And, I think the creative aspect of being able to, personalize stuff and recommend, it could be wellness vacations, trips, massages, things like that, and being able to redeem it right through the system, provides, this ease of access to employees that I would think would make them more productive, more refocused. So I think it's very cool that approach that you have done. And, are you looking at this as really mental health? When I'm talking about, let's say, the wellness side of it, of being able to redeem things, or is it productivity? Is it morale? Is it all of them?
So there's that side of it. And certainly a lot of employers now are increasingly aware, as you said in the beginning, of the implication of burnout on employees, but also on the bottom line, right? Of course, there are ways to quantify, loss of productivity and increased turnover when it comes to the actual cost of it from the employer's perspective. But in terms of our offering, even way before the wellness implications, both positively and negatively, on people not taking time off, it is important to mention in this context that there is a more direct and immediate financial implication that is actually quite detrimental to a business when it comes to unused paid time off. Again, both from an employee and from an employer perspective. So if you'll bear with me for a second, if it's okay, I'll just explain for a second how actually paid time off actually works. And that would be easier to explain why there's a financial wellness aspect to this that is actually even more immediate and quantifiable than the wellness aspect to this solution. Is that okay?
All right.
Great. So essentially, paid time off, if you're an employee at a company and you're allocated a certain allocation of paid time off, what this means in effect is that, as I mentioned before, your employee actually pays you not to work for a portion of your time. So for the sake of simplicity, if we put some numbers behind it, say, for example, that an employee is eligible for 12 days off a year. This means that on an average month, they're supposed to work for 19 days and then paid not to work 1 day on average, right? The problem happens when people don't use that day, right? And as we said, a lot of people don't use all of their days. So on that average month, if a person doesn't use their one allocated of paid time off, what actually happens is that the employee worked 20 days, but their salary reflects 19 days. They were paid for 19, and they worked an extra day for which they haven't been paid yet. What happens at this point is that you earn an asset for that day called accrued time off. You haven't been paid with cash, you've been paid with accrued time. You will see it on your payslip. You will see it on your HR system. It has a clear financial value to it, right? It's derived from your annual salary. It's yours, you've earned it. But you can't take it and pay with it at the supermarket, right? You can't pay with it at Starbucks. You own it, it's yours, you've earned it, but you won't be able to do anything with it until some unknown point in the future when you leave the company, which is more often than not when lots of companies will offer this in cash ultimately when you leave. And then that's the optimal scenario, right? Because a lot of companies either apply a use it or lose it policy, or they have a cap or an expiration date on the number of days you can accrue. But in the best case scenario, you're holding on to this asset until some unknown point in the future. Of course, this can happen in a year's time, but it could also happen in 10 or 15 or 20 years time. Only then when you leave the company will you get paid for those extra days that you've already worked. And that's the financial implication on the employee side. Essentially, a portion of your hard-earned compensation gets locked away and you can't touch it. Now, on the employer side, as soon as the employee begins to hold this illiquid asset, this accrued time, there is a liability on the company balance sheet. Because as we've just explained, the employee worked, but the company hasn't paid them yet. The company effectively owes the employee this money. And so it appears as a liability on the balance sheet, but it's actually a pretty unique liability in that you can't predict it, right? It shows up whenever an employee doesn't take their time. You never know when you're going to have to pay it out. So think about taking a mortgage or a loan from a bank and being in a position where you can literally get surprised in any given moment when an employee leaves. It's when you have to pay it out. And worst of all, it's fixed on the salary level of the employee. So ultimately, when the employee leaves in 10 or 15 years time, you're going to have to pay this out according to their salary then. So it actually appreciates over time. So it's a really bad liability with really great financial implications for the employer, and then a really bad situation for the employee as well. And it's a lose-lose situation. And then, as we mentioned before, on top of that, there's the wellness and burnout and productivity and turnover and all of that from a strictly wellness perspective. So it's a much deeper problem when it comes to unused PTO.
No, I like the segue because it shows how it ties into kind of mental health recharge, but also the financial well-being side.
Yes.
One segue myself is, one of the sponsor for our podcast is Global Healthcare Accreditation for Business, which set the gold standard in the industry for validating companies' prioritization of employee health, safety, and well-being. And of course, they touch both the physical health, the mental health, and also the financial well-being. But, part of their thing is just transparency. and then communicating to employees what you're really doing for them. And I feel like this tool that you have developed, provides that transparency around PTO in a way that there hasn't been that transparency in the past. And I would think that with the Great Resignation and companies trying to differentiate themselves and recruit people, retain people, this is kind of an attractive tool to do that.
I agree. And I think the Great Resignation is actually a great point, because we are seeing massive resignations now. And so we believe that our solution works, again, in two ways. One is that, it is an amazing benefit to provide your employees as an incentive, as a retention tool effectively, and as an incentive to stay. But also, I mean, if this actually occurs and massive amounts of employees begin to resign, the implication from a cash flow perspective is really significant. It could be incredibly impactful. I mean, all of a sudden, all of this accrued time, and particularly for more tenured and more senior employees, this could be significant amounts of money that you all of a sudden have to pay out to employees. And the ability to A, predict it in advance, and B, be able to refinance it through us could be very, very significant to employers now as they begin to kind of grapple what this massive resignation looks like.
What percentage of people are taking the PTO versus, maybe not taking it? And then the second question I have is that what percentage of people would take the cash or the other redemption benefits, versus taking PTO?
So it's one of the most fascinating things that we've started to kind of analyze. And I think, one thing that I can start off by saying is that we're seeing this across the board. It's such a huge cultural issue in the United States around the legitimacy or lack thereof to take time off, to take care of yourself, to actually take time. We really are living under a corporate culture that doesn't view taking care of yourself very favorably. And kind of part of the problem now is you're seeing lots of incentives around reducing the work week for a 4-day work week, or doing things like that. Is that it doesn't really solve the problem, because even if you shorten the work week for 4 days, a person needs to feel legitimized to, even under those 4 days, be able to come to their manager and say, listen, I feel burnt out, I feel stressed out, I need to take a day. And if that doesn't happen, if you don't, change the discussion and change the culture and provide tools and provide processes to support that, then you didn't really do anything. And so to start answering your question, we're seeing this problem across the board. It really does cross sector, industry, size, and any other parameter out there. I can tell you a lot of little interesting things that we've seen. So first, there's an inverse correlation between seniority and taking time off. The more senior people are, the less time they take. That makes a lot of sense. It also makes the problem from a financial perspective and from a wellness perspective that much more grave, because senior people do tend to earn more, and so the liability is that much more expensive. But they're also supposed to, provide an example, right, to their employees, and talking about culture and talking about the fact that people don't feel comfortable asking for time off really starts with managers leading by example and being able to show that it's okay. It's not only okay, it's actually necessary to take time off. If you do take time off, and all research shows that overwhelmingly, if you do take time off frequently, that makes you a better performer. That means you're that much more productive, that much more creative, that much more focused. And so people think that if they burn the midnight oil, if they work 24/7, 365, it makes them better. It actually doesn't. So there's a lot of data points around that. We're seeing a little bit of difference between gender. Women do, young mothers particularly, tend to take more time off. They're first to take time off because they don't necessarily have enough time to take in the form of sick leave. And parental leave and things like that. So I can speak to that for hours, but I think the most important thing to mention is the cultural aspect, and how we need to shift kind of culture around the legitimacy to take time to take care of yourself.
I agree with you on that. I think, because of the fact of the pressure from the last 2 years of the pandemic, I've been trying to be an advocate of that myself within my own company, where before, it'd be work, work, work. Now it's even, key employees that you really need for important projects, it's like, no, you need to take that time off because, if you don't, you're going to, not be as productive. You're going to be more stressed, and you need that, you need that relaxation, that break from work, to be the best that you can.
Yeah, another thing that's happening now that we're seeing is because people do work remote, they travel and they continue working. And that's on the one hand something really cool, this idea that you're nomadic and you're agnostic to geography, and you can actually go anywhere and work from there. But what it's actually creating is a situation where it's even further delegitimized to actually take time and go off the grid and shut your laptop off and shut your phone down and not work. And so people are in this constant loop of, no matter where they are, they're constantly working. And taking time off means taking time off. Even if you're on a beach in Mexico, if you're constantly taking Zooms and on Slack or answering emails 24/7, that's not vacation, right? That's not going to help you recharge.
Veetahl, what made you just decide, I'm going to create a company around PTO, that's also going to have a well-being play, especially not coming from an entrepreneurial background? Like, how did this all come about?
So I think that sometime during the pandemic, I actually almost stumbled upon this. I started talking to lots and lots of employers across the US, and really just trying to understand, where they were, what type of things were on their minds, what was challenging them and their employees. And without specifically asking about this and without specifically researching the space, I just kept hearing time and time again that employers were concerned about the fact that their employees were not taking any time off. And one of the most interesting aspects to this, and it's kind of a recurring theme throughout our discussion, is that as a problem, as a pain, this came up from multiple stakeholders within the organization, right? It came up from HR and people teams, from a burnout and turnover concern, but it also came up from the finance organization because, as we mentioned, there are some grave implications from a financial perspective on companies when people don't take time off. And so, the more I heard from it, the more I heard about it. And it's one of those things, as you kind of said, it's been kind of laying there in plain sight, waiting for someone to come in and disrupt it because it has been so severely broken for such a long time. And just so you understand the scope of this, each year, from year to year, US employers carry over more than $272 billion in unused vacation days. That's over 900 million days that people actually could use, towards their well-being, to recharge, to recoup, to come back better performers, and they don't, and they leave it, and it's massive. It's a massive, massive market failure that begs to be fixed.
What future creative ideas do you have of what employees will be able to redeem their PTO for that they don't have available to them today? What can we all look forward to?
So one of the things that we, when you're creating products, one of the most important things is to have that almost naive curiosity and be very open-minded and kind of understand what people's needs actually are. And what we're seeing, for example, which is something that I didn't necessarily predict this in advance, but we're seeing very different types of companies with very different types of employees. So there, if I had to say two very distinct group of people that we're currently seeing in our pipeline. So there's a group of employers who if you ask their employees what their most scarce asset is, they would say time, right? I don't have time, I need more time. And so, with unlocking this time and with unlocking that portion of designated budget toward this time, it makes a lot more sense to offer things around travel and hospitality and wellness and experiences and things like that. And tomorrow it could be things like long-term savings and, more interesting offerings around that. There's an entirely different group of companies we're seeing in our pipeline, which have more, minimum wage hourly workers in their workforce. And for these people, if you ask them what's their most scarce asset, it would be money. And for them, you know, it's a very different approach where we're telling them, listen, this is a portion of your compensation that you've earned, that you worked hard for, that you wouldn't have access to otherwise for many years to come. And we can unlock this portion of your compensation now. And that can go towards, you know, more daily expenses like groceries and electricity and rent and, you know, other things like that. So we're looking into, you know, a broad array of financial and wellness products.
Very cool. Well, thank you for joining us on the Edelheit Experience. It's exciting to see the direction you're going and wish you the best of luck. You know, I feel like this is something that's so unique and there's really not competition in this space. It seemed kind of like a no-brainer, and it definitely, I think, segues the financial area within a company looking at that liability of the PTO over into the wellness department of you know, making people recharged and feel better.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today and for giving me this amazing platform.